My name is Nathaniel. I never thought the man who built this family with his own hands would one day be told to shut up at his own daughter's table. The words, "nobody cares," didn't just hang in the air. They seeped into the wood of the table I'd helped buy, poisoning a lifetime of memories in an instant. My fork, loaded with a piece of the roast I'd probably indirectly paid for, froze halfway to my mouth. I saw my son-in-law Mark not just smirking, but actively hiding a laugh behind his napkin, his shoulders shaking with silent amusement. My grandchildren didn't just look at their plates. The eldest, a boy of 10, mimed a tiny violin with his fingers under the table, a gesture he'd clearly learned from his parents. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was a coordinated performance, and I was the punchline. That night, I made a decision that would not just wound my daughter, but systematically dismantle the world she so carelessly took for granted. But you won't believe what I did next. From the very beginning, my life was a ledger of debits paid for her credits. I didn't just grow up with little. I grew up in the kind of crushing poverty where the cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a presence that lived in your bones, and hunger was a sharp-toothed animal gnawing at your insides. The smallness wasn't just about space, it was about a life where dreams were a luxury you couldn't afford. When my daughter, Chloe, was born, I made a blood oath to myself that she would never know that feeling. I didn't just work every hour, I sold my hours, my health, my youth. My days weren't just on construction sites, they were in a Rust Belt factory where I operated a press that could, and did, for the man before me, shear off fingers. The smell of hot metal and my own fierce sweat was my cologne. My nights weren't spent in dark garages, they were in a slaughterhouse, cleaning drains clogged with blood and offal, the coppery stench so deep in my nostrils that I couldn't smell my own daughter's hair when I kissed her goodnight. Every ache in my back was a vertebra grinding against another, a permanent injury from a fall I never reported because we needed the paycheck. Every callus was a shield, and every blister was a badge of honor, because when I came home she was there, my little girl. I still remember her first steps not as a stumble, but as a frantic, determined lunge across a floor I'd scrubbed on my hands and knees, her tiny body collapsing into my arms, trusting me to always be there to catch her. In that moment, I felt like a king. My wallet was empty, but my heart was a vault. When school came, I didn't just pay fees, I paid a toll to a world I wasn't allowed to enter. I never let her miss a trip because I remembered the shame of being the only kid left behind in a silent classroom. I never let her sit at home embarrassed. I once sold a box of my late wife's books, the last physical pieces of her I had, to buy Chloe a school uniform. The meals I skipped weren't just skipped. I developed a chronic, gnawing ulcer from a diet of black coffee and cheap bread, sipping chalky antacid medicine for dinner while I listened to her sleep, her belly full. I would smile through the pain, the acid burning my throat, because that was my religion. That was what a father did. She wanted to go to college. I didn't hesitate. I didn't just sell my old car. I sold the '67 Mustang I'd spent a decade restoring with my father, the one tangible connection I had to him. I didn't just take out loans. I signed my name on a dotted line that pledged my future, my body, my very soul to a bank. I worked overtime until my hands didn't just shake, they developed a permanent, fine tremor, a condition the doctor said was from nerve damage and chronic exhaustion. And when she walked across that stage, a gown covering the designer clothes I'd paid for, a diploma in the hand that had never known a day of real labor, I wept. Not proud tears, but the desperate, ragged sobs of a man who has just unloaded a burden he's carried for so long he's forgotten how to stand without it. Then came her wedding. I watched her walk down the aisle, a vision of manufactured perfection, and for a moment, I saw the ghost of her mother in the turn of her head. I had lost my Isabella to cancer that ate through our savings long before it took her life, but in that moment, I felt her absence like a physical wound. I paid for the reception. Every flower was a funeral bouquet for my own financial security. Every plate of food was a month I'd have to work past my retirement age. People didn't just tell me I was foolish. My own brother didn't speak to me for a year, calling me a slave to an ungrateful child. But how could I not? She was my daughter. Her happiness was a debt I had to pay, no matter the cost. Even after she married Mark, a man with a slick smile and a handshake that felt like a threat, I kept giving. When they wanted a home, I didn't just help with the loan. I drained my $401k, accepting the brutal tax penalties to provide the deposit. I co-signed the papers, my signature a shackle. Every corner of that house didn't just carry a piece of me, it was built on the foundation of my broken body and extinguished dreams. The paint on the walls was the color of my blood. The garden in the yard was fertilized with my sacrifice. The porch light that kept them safe at night was powered by the current of my lifelong anxiety. I thought to myself, this house will always be my sanctuary. This table will always have a seat for me. And the dinners, to me, they weren't just sacred, they were my only sacrament. After Isabella died, they were the altar upon which I laid my loneliness, hoping for a miracle of connection. I wanted my daughter and her children to know that sitting at this table was about more than consumption, it was about communion. Every time she invited me, it was a performance. I put on my best shirt, the one without the frayed collar I couldn't afford to replace. I polished my shoes until I could see the hollows of my own tired eyes in the leather. I brought gifts for the grandchildren, not to spoil them, but as bribes for their attention, little offerings to the gods of a family that was slowly forgetting me. I wanted them to hear my stories not as rambling monologues, but as oral histories, the last living record of people who mattered. I told them about the war my father fought, not as a history lesson, but as a horror story he'd carried in his eyes until the day he died. I told them about building houses with my bare hands, the splinters I'd gotten, the time a beam nearly fell and crushed me. I told them about their grandmother's laughter, a sound so pure it could momentarily silence the factory roar in my head. I wanted them to see me not as an old man in a chair, but as the living, breathing cornerstone of their existence. Sitting at that table, I felt like I still had a pulse. I saw my family, my blood. And I thought, this is the interest on my pain, this is the dividend on my sacrifice. That's why the insult later was a mortal wound, because for me, those dinners were not casual. They were my reason for still breathing. I no longer had my wife. My friends were dead or had drifted away, unable to watch my self-immolation. My body was a collection of aches and diagnosed maladies, but when I sat at that table, telling a story, I was whole. I believed, with the foolish faith of a zealot, that my daughter understood this, that she valued this fragile, sacred space as much as I did. I never expected her to see my words as noise. I never thought the history I offered was clutter, but I was wrong. The night she told me to shut up, I saw the truth in her eyes. To her, I wasn't the patriarch. I wasn't the foundation. I was just a piece of the furniture, an old, worn-out armchair that was starting to smell faintly of decay and took up too much space. It didn't happen all at once. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one so small I could almost pretend it didn't bleed. My daughter, the same child I once rushed to the emergency room after she'd fallen from a tree, holding her broken arm steady with a tenderness I didn't know I possessed, began to treat me with a casual, almost reflexive contempt. At first, it was just her tone, a sigh that sounded like the release of a pressure valve of resentment. A small eye roll when I repeated a story, as if the memory of her mother's courage was a boring anecdote. I made excuses. She's tired, she has children, Mark is a difficult man. But then the cuts grew deeper, sharper. At dinners, when I started a sentence about Isabella, she would cut me off with a surgical "Dad, we've heard this already." The words were a scalpel, severing the thread that connected me to my late wife. My wife's memory was not a repeat story to me. It was the last flickering candle in the dark church of my life, and she was blowing it out. The grandchildren, sharp-eyed little mimics, learned their cues perfectly. When I began speaking, they'd glance at their mother first, a silent referendum on whether my words had value. I saw the 7-year-old, once my favorite, practice the same eye roll in a hallway mirror, perfecting her performance of disdain. The pattern solidified into a prison. If I asked a question about her day, her voice would become a weapon. "Dad, I don't have time for this." If I suggested a book for the children, she would snap. "We know how to raise our kids," her voice dripping with a venom that said, "Your influence is no longer welcome here." I sat there, a nodding dog on the dashboard of their lives, my lips sealed to keep the howl of pain locked inside. I told myself the fairy tale that daughters love their fathers. But the truth was a vine, tightening around my heart, and its name was indifference. Once I brought a photo album I'd spent months carefully assembling. It wasn't just pictures, it was my heart laid bare on the glossy pages. Images of her mother pregnant, beaming, pictures of me young and strong, holding her as a baby, photos of the cramped apartment we'd been so happy in. I laid it on the table like a peace offering. Chloe glanced at it, sighed with the profound weariness of someone being handed a bag of garbage, and said, "Dad, we don't need old pictures lying around. Please don't clutter the house with this." She pushed the album aside as if it were a used napkin. I felt something vital in my chest snap. Those weren't just pictures, they were the proof that I had existed, that I had loved, that I had been happy. To her, they were clutter. The worst was Mark. He started with subtle digs. "Getting a bit forgetful, eh, Nate?" he'd say when I struggled for a word. Then it escalated. One night I was telling a story about a friend from the factory, a man who'd lost 2 fingers to the same machine I operated. I hesitated, the man's name just out of reach. Mark chuckled, not even bothering to lower his voice, and muttered, "The lights are on, but nobody's home." Chloe laughed with him, a bright, tinkling sound that was more brutal than any shout. I felt myself disappearing, becoming a ghost in their brightly lit world. I endured it. I remembered the nights I'd held her through pneumonia, my own body shaking with fear. I remembered walking 5 miles through a blizzard to a temp job because the buses weren't running, also her Christmas wouldn't be lean. I remembered the feel of her small arms around my neck, the whisper of "I love you, Daddy," a spell that had once made every hardship vanish. How could that love have just evaporated? I told myself it was a season, a bad season that she would remember. But the winter in her heart was setting in for good. I noticed the calls only came when she needed money for a new car repair or when Mark's business hit a slow patch. She never asked how I was, even as the tremor in my hand worsened and a chronic cough took root in my lungs. When I spoke at the table, the room didn't just grow quiet, it grew cold, as if my very presence lowered the temperature. I was no longer a source of joy. I was a financial utility, a human ATM that occasionally told boring stories. I ignored the truth until it was a beast staring me in the face, its hot breath on my neck. I wasn't her father anymore. I was a tenant in her life, and my lease was up. And then came the night, the final dinner. It was supposed to be ordinary. The long table was set with a meal I'd likely funded. I came dressed in my armor, my best shirt, my shine shoes. I was a knight reporting for duty at a castle he'd built but no longer owned. The food was passed. Laughter echoed, a sound from which I was increasingly excluded. I was a spectator at the feast of my own life. In a lull, I saw my chance. I looked at my grandchildren and began, my voice soft with the weight of the memory. "You know, when your grandmother was your age, she used to work in a factory that made uniforms. One day, she saw a woman get her hair torn out by a machine. She was the only one who ran to help, her own hands getting covered in blood. I wanted them to know their grandmother wasn't just a pretty face in a photo. She was courage and compassion incarnate." I saw Chloe stiffen. Her eyes, which I once thought held the universe, narrowed into slits of pure, undiluted impatience. And then, sharp as a shard of glass, she sliced through my story, through my memory, through me. "Shut up, Dad, nobody cares." The words didn't hang in the air, they detonated. The shut up was a command. The nobody cares was a verdict. My fork froze. For a second I was convinced I'd had a stroke, that this was a neurological event. But it was real. Mark didn't just chuckle, he let out a full-throated laugh, a sound of genuine entertainment. The grandchildren were statues of embarrassment, the youngest actually sliding down in his chair to disappear. The silence that followed was the most violent sound I have ever heard. It was the sound of my entire life being invalidated. I lowered my fork. The food turned to powdered bone in my mouth. I set it down with a quiet click that screamed in the silence. I let her have the last word because I knew, with a terrifying clarity, that she meant it. This was not a moment of stress. This was the truth, finally spoken aloud. The conversation resumed around me as if I had vanished. I was a ghost, haunting the remains of my own legacy. I sat through the rest of the meal, a smiling corpse, while inside, a city of memories and sacrifices burned to the ground. When the plates were cleared, I stood, my movements slow and deliberate, the calm of a man who has accepted his own death. I didn't look at them. I gathered my coat, my hand trembling not with weakness, but with the seismic energy of a decision being born. No one asked if I was okay. No one noticed the tectonic shift happening in the old man in the corner. To them, it was Tuesday. To me, it was the end of the world. Before I reveal what happened next, I want you to pause for a moment. Where are you watching this from right now? Let me know in the comments. And if you're understanding my pain, please subscribe so this story can reach others. That night I didn't drive straight home. I sat in my car in their driveway, the engine off, the cold seeping into my joints. I watched the golden rectangle of their kitchen window, the shadow play of a family that had just euthanized its patriarch. The words, "nobody cares," looped in my mind, a hellish mantra. I remembered the hunger. I remembered the smell of the slaughterhouse. I remembered the feel of my father's Mustang's steering wheel in my hands the day I sold it. I thought of Isabella, and I knew she would have wept not for my humiliation, but for the monster our love had created. For nearly an hour I dissected my life. I was not a father. I was a resource, a story on repeat, a chair to be tolerated. The love I thought was a bond was a transaction, and my account was now empty. The truth was a clean, cold knife. Love does not require humiliation. Sacrifice should not demand the surrender of dignity. As the night grew colder, my resolve crystallized. I would not endure another second of this. There would be no confrontation, no screaming match. That would be giving them what they wanted, a reaction, a spectacle. No, my response would be silent, surgical, and absolute. I started the engine and drove home not with the weight of shame, but with the terrifying lightness of a man who has nothing left to lose. When I woke the next morning, her voice was still there in my head. "Shut up, Dad." But now it was a catalyst. I felt a power I hadn't known in decades. It wasn't the hot, messy power of anger. It was the cold, clean power of the truth. She thought I was a feeble old man clinging to the past. She had forgotten that the past was written on paper, and my name was on every page. I sat at my kitchen table and opened the lockbox. Inside was the evidence of my life, the deed to their house, where my name was listed as the primary owner, a fact they'd forgotten in their comfort. The title for her luxury SUV, leased in my name because their credit wasn't good enough. The paperwork for the investment accounts I'd set up for my grandchildren's college, which I alone controlled. She had been living in a house of cards I had built, and she had just blown on it. I picked up my phone. I called my lawyer, a man who had handled my affairs for 30 years. My voice was calm, flat. "Lawrence," I said, "I need you to do the following. Remove Chloe's name from my will. Freeze every joint account. List the house for sale yesterday. Contact the dealership and have her car repossessed. Liquidate the children's college funds and transfer the assets to a new private account." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Nathaniel," he said, "are you sure this is extreme?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "Make it happen." Then I packed a single suitcase, a few practical clothes, the photograph of Isabella from my nightstand, the folder of documents. I was not running away. I was conducting a strategic retreat. I walked through my small, quiet house, touching the memories one last time. The pencil marks on the doorframe charting Chloe's growth now looked like the bars of a cage I had built for myself. There was grief, but it was for the love that had died, not for the things I was leaving behind. With the suitcase by the door, I picked up my keys. They were not just keys, they were the instruments of my liberation. I did not look back. I got in my car and drove away from the city, from the insults, from the life that was no longer mine. I drove until I found a cheap motel in a town I'd never heard of. The room was bleak, but it was mine. It was a blank slate. For the first time in decades, I was not a father, a provider, a patriarch. I was just a man. And in that terrifying, exhilarating silence, I began to plan the rest of my life. The silence in that motel room was a physical presence. It wasn't the empty silence of my own house, which was always filled with the ghosts of memory. This was a new, raw silence, a clean slate. For 3 days, I did nothing but sit by the window, watching the unfamiliar traffic, and think. My lawyer, Lawrence, called with updates. The house was officially on the market. The bank had frozen the accounts. The dealership was preparing to take the car. With every update, a little more of the weight I'd carried for 40 years dissolved, leaving behind a strange, weightless feeling, like an astronaut cut from his tether. The calls from Chloe started on the 4th day. The first one was all sharp, performative annoyance. "Dad, where are you? This is ridiculous. Mark says the bank called about the account. What's going on?" I listened to the message, her tone like the crack of a whip, and felt nothing. I deleted it. The second wave of calls, a day later, had a new edge, confusion laced with the first flicker of genuine fear. "Dad, seriously? A realtor came by the house. She had a for sale sign. You need to call me back right now. This isn't funny." I imagined her standing in the foyer of her house, watching a stranger measure the windows, the reality of my absence beginning to dawn on her like a slow-acting poison. The third call was pure, undiluted panic. Her voice was ragged, stripped of all its condescending polish. "Dad, please, they're taking the car. They just drove it away. You can't do this. Where are you? I'm your daughter, please." The word daughter was a shriek, a weapon she was trying to use one last time. It shattered against the wall of my resolve. I didn't delete this one. I saved it. I wanted a record of the exact moment the foundation of her world gave way. Mark left one message. His was all bluster and impotent rage. "Nathaniel, you senile old bastard. You're tearing this family apart. This is betrayal. When we find you..." I deleted it halfway through. His anger was noise. It was Chloe's terror that was the signal. I didn't stay in the motel. I used the cash I'd withdrawn before freezing the accounts and bought a decade-old four-wheel drive truck from a grim-faced farmer. It smelled of hay and diesel. It was real. It was mine. I drove north towards the mountains, following no map but the one in my head that led away from them. I rented a small, Spartan cabin perched on the side of a hill, its porch looking out over a vast, indifferent wilderness. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and decay. It was the smell of freedom. Here the silence was different again. It was deep and full. It was the silence of nature, which asks for nothing and offers no judgment. I began to build a new routine, one that served only me. I woke with the sun. I learned to split wood, the axe a satisfying weight in my hands, the crack of the log a testament to a direct, uncomplicated effort. I planted a small vegetable garden, my gnarled hands, which had once signed away my future, now burying seeds in the dark soil. The simple, tangible result of a seed becoming a plant was a truth I could understand. It was the opposite of raising a child. Lawrence kept me informed. The offers on the house were coming in low, the market was slow. Chloe was fighting it, trying to prove some claim to it, but the paperwork was ironclad. My name, my signature, my money, her name was on nothing. She was a guest who had overstayed her welcome and was now being evicted from a life she had never truly owned. I thought of the grandchildren often, not with the desperate, aching love of before, but with a distant, melancholic pity. I had wanted to give them a legacy of love and history. Instead, I was giving them a lesson in consequences. I hoped, one day, they would understand that silence isn't weakness and that a man's value isn't determined by how much abuse he will tolerate. Weeks bled into months. The calls stopped. The silence was complete. My new life was a small, quiet, but perfectly formed thing. I was no longer Nathaniel, the human bank, the storytelling ghost. I was just a man in a cabin, accountable to no one. The peace was profound. It was the peace of a battlefield after the war is lost and won, when there is nothing left to fight for and therefore nothing left to lose. Then one afternoon in late autumn, a car I didn't recognize, a modest, dented sedan, came grinding its way up my gravel drive. My body went still. I was sitting on the porch, sharpening a hatchet, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. The driver's door opened and Chloe got out. She looked reduced. The expensive highlights in her hair had grown out, revealing her natural, mousy brown. Her clothes were from a discount store. The entitled confidence that had once been her armor was gone, replaced by a weary uncertainty. She stood by the car for a long moment, hugging herself against the mountain cold, looking at the cabin, at the woods, at me. She was a stranger from a civilization I had fled. She walked towards the porch, her steps hesitant. "Dad," she said, her voice thin and frayed. I didn't stop sharpening the hatchet. The rhythmic scrape, filled the space where my words would have been. "We lost the house," she said, the statement hanging in the cold air. "We're in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side. Mark's gone. He left a month after the money dried up." Scrape. Tears started in her eyes, but they weren't the performative tears of a child who wasn't getting her way. These were the slow, painful tears of a woman who had finally run out of excuses. "I lost everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. I finally looked up, setting the hatchet and stone aside. My gaze was steady, devoid of the old man's softness she was used to. "No," I said, my voice calm and clear in the thin mountain air. "You lost what was never yours. There's a difference." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She flinched. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I was stressed. I was a monster. I became someone Mom would have hated." I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of her own admission press her down. An apology was just a sound. It couldn't rebuild a house. It couldn't resurrect a father's trust. An apology doesn't unsell a car, Chloe, I said, my voice flat. It doesn't put a roof back over your head. It's just a word. I know, she cried, the dam breaking. I know that now, but I'm your daughter, your blood. That was the one thing I thought was priceless, I replied, looking out at the valley below. You treated it as if it had no value at all. You devalued the one currency that mattered. She stood there, shivering, completely disarmed. The scripts she had relied on, the guilt, the familial obligation, the wounded daughter, were useless here. I had rewritten the rules of the game by refusing to play. I have a life here, I said, gesturing to the cabin, the woods, the silence. It's a quiet life, a peaceful one. I will not allow you or anyone to disrupt it. You can visit, on my terms, but you will never speak to me with disrespect again. You will never treat me as an inconvenience. That man is gone. She nodded, a quick, jerky motion, understanding the terms of this new, fragile armistice. And you will tell your children the truth, I added, my final condition. You will tell them why their grandfather lives here, in this cabin, and not in the house he built for you. You will tell them that respect is the real inheritance, and you squandered it. It's the only legacy I have left to give them. She looked at me then, and for the first time I saw not my little girl, but a woman humbled by the consequences of her own cruelty. There was no instant forgiveness, no warm Hollywood reconciliation. The damage was a canyon between us, too wide to cross with a single "I'm sorry." But a narrow, precarious bridge had been built, a bridge made not of love, but of hard, unyielding truth. She visits now once a season. She brings the children. They are quieter, more watchful. They help me in the garden without being asked. I tell them stories about their grandmother, about her fierce love and her stubborn courage, and this time they listen. Chloe listens too. I see the effort in her eyes, the struggle to relearn a language of respect she had forgotten. The love is still there, but it's a different love, scarred, tempered in the fire of loss, and bound by the unspoken, ironclad understanding that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. She told me to shut up, and in my silence, I taught her the devastating cost of those words. Now we both live with the echo. I am at peace. She lives with the consequence, and in the quiet of my mountain cabin, that feels like the only justice that ever really mattered.